A storm does not decide who survives. It only reveals who refuses to leave another behind. The warning sirens had been sounding for almost an hour when the first wall of white swallowed the Vega frontier. Sheets of frozen particles rolled across the barren landscape with enough force to erase mountains from sight, while violent electromagnetic waves crackled through the dark sky like silent rivers of blue fire. Navigation satellites disappeared one after another. Communication towers faded into static. Even automated rescue drones turned back toward shelter after their guidance systems failed beneath the growing storm. Only one small emergency outpost still remained active on the frozen plain. Its weathered steel walls trembled beneath every blast of icy wind, while dim amber lights struggled against the endless darkness outside. Jacob Miller tightened the final bolt on an aging thermal generator before glancing toward the status monitor mounted above the maintenance bench. The temperature inside the station held at a livable 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the reading had already fallen below -90 degrees. He quietly exhaled against the visor of his insulated helmet before hanging a heavy repair wrench beside the entrance. The old rescue station had survived countless storms. Jacob intended to make certain it survived one more. Years earlier, he had served as an emergency responder across dangerous frontier colonies, where storms often claimed more lives than conflict ever could. Since then, he had learned one simple lesson. Machines failed. Weather never negotiated. People still deserved someone willing to search for them anyway. A faint electronic chirp interrupted the steady hum of the generator. Jacob turned toward the communications console. A weak signal flickered across the display before dissolving into static. He frowned and adjusted the receiver frequency. The sound returned. It lasted barely 2 seconds before disappearing once again. Most operators would have dismissed it as interference caused by electromagnetic activity. Jacob did not. He increased the receiver sensitivity and listened carefully. Another pulse appeared. Weak, broken, artificial. It resembled the emergency beacon carried inside survival suits used throughout neighboring systems. The signal repeated at irregular intervals, each transmission slightly weaker than the last. Jacob quietly studied the direction indicator. Southwest, approximately 5 miles from the outpost, directly inside the most dangerous section of the storm. He looked through the reinforced observation window. Nothing existed beyond the swirling wall of white. Visibility measured only a few feet. The landscape itself seemed erased beneath moving ice and electrical snow. Common sense advised waiting until the storm weakened. Experience told him the beacon would not last that long. Without hesitation, he opened a storage locker and removed a heavy thermal rescue pack. He checked spare power cells, emergency heating blankets, portable medical supplies, and climbing line before securing everything across his shoulders. Every movement followed habits built through years of answering impossible calls. Before opening the outer airlock, Jacob glanced once more toward the emergency receiver. The faint signal pulsed again. Still alive. Still waiting. The massive outer door slowly unlocked with a low mechanical sound. Freezing wind immediately forced its way inside, carrying countless frozen crystals that shimmered beneath the station lights like fragments of broken stars. Jacob lowered his visor, activated his helmet beacon, and stepped into the storm without knowing whose life waited beyond the endless white. Far across the frozen wasteland, beneath layers of drifting snow and scattered wreckage, a single sapphire blue hand remained barely visible above the ice before another wave of wind quietly buried it again. Jacob leaned into the storm until every step became a negotiation with the wind. Ice crystals struck the visor of his helmet like handfuls of fine sand, while blue flashes rolled across the clouds overhead, turning the endless white landscape into brief moments of ghostly daylight before darkness swallowed everything again. His navigation display flickered under constant electromagnetic interference, forcing him to rely on an old emergency compass mounted beside his wrist scanner. The faint rescue beacon pulsed once more. Slightly stronger, slightly closer. He adjusted his direction by a few degrees and continued forward. Snow reached above his knees in some places, making every yard feel longer than the last. His thermal suit compensated for the brutal cold, but the power indicator slowly dropped with every passing minute. He knew exactly how much time remained before the heating system would begin reducing output to preserve life support. The calculation stayed quietly in the back of his mind, never distracting him from the signal ahead. Another pulse echoed through his headset. This time it carried a fragment of encoded Vega emergency identification before dissolving into static. Jacob slowed for the first time. Vega. He had met Vega traders years ago, but frontier rumors painted their military and nobility as distant people who rarely trusted outsiders, especially humans. The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. A rescue beacon did not belong to an enemy. It belonged to someone who needed help. He climbed over a ridge of wind-packed ice and scanned the frozen valley below. Nothing. Only shifting snow driven sideways by relentless gusts. Then a tiny reflection caught his eye beneath another wave of blowing ice. It disappeared immediately. Jacob moved toward it, carefully probing the snow ahead with a collapsible rescue pole. 2 more steps. Another faint reflection. He dropped to one knee and brushed away frozen layers with insulated gloves. Blue skin appeared beneath the snow. A slender hand. Motionless. His heartbeat quickened, but his movements remained steady. He cleared more ice until the outline of an armored escape suit emerged from the drift. The emergency pod nearby had split open during impact, its outer shell nearly buried beneath accumulating snow. Jacob immediately attached a portable heat projector beside the figure while checking the suit diagnostics. Most external systems had failed. One emergency cell continued supplying minimal life support. Barely enough. He cleared the remaining snow from her shoulders and carefully lifted her helmet visor just enough to inspect the internal display. Soft breaths fogged the transparent shield. Alive. Relief settled quietly inside him. Her face looked impossibly calm despite the storm surrounding them. Sapphire blue skin reflected faint silver light beneath the projector. Long silver hair escaped from beneath the damaged helmet, frozen into delicate strands by the cold. Her closed eyes shimmered beneath pale lashes while a small crystal pendant rested against the protective collar of her suit. Jacob had never seen anyone who looked remotely like her, yet exhaustion and vulnerability made her appear less like a mysterious traveler and more like someone who had simply reached the end of her strength. He activated a thermal rescue blanket and wrapped it securely around her before checking the distance back to the outpost. 5 miles through conditions growing worse by the minute. There would be no vehicle, no drone, no additional rescue team. Only one path remained. Jacob secured her carefully against his back using reinforced emergency straps, tightened every connection twice, and slowly rose to his feet beneath the combined weight. As he adjusted his balance, the unconscious woman stirred slightly for the first time. Her silver eyes opened only halfway before focusing weakly on the human carrying her. Fear flickered across her expression for a single fragile moment, as though everything she had ever been taught warned her not to trust the face looking back at her. Jacob spoke softly through the storm before taking his first step toward home. "You are safe now. We are getting out of this together." Jacob adjusted the rescue straps one final time before taking another slow step into the white emptiness. The storm pushed against him with relentless force, covering his tracks almost as quickly as they formed. Every gust carried frozen particles that rattled across his visor, while blue electrical arcs flashed silently above the endless ice fields. The world had become nothing but wind, snow, and the quiet rhythm of 2 lives moving together through impossible weather. The woman resting against his back remained weak, yet he could feel faint movement each time she struggled to stay conscious. Her breathing had become steadier beneath the thermal blanket, but the portable life monitor attached to her damaged survival suit still displayed unstable readings. Jacob lowered his head against another blast of wind and kept walking. The distance to the rescue station slowly decreased 1 yard at a time. His suit computer warned that the thermal battery had fallen below 60%. He acknowledged the alert without stopping. The priority had never changed. Reach shelter before either of them lost too much heat. Behind him, the woman opened her silver eyes again. They remained unfocused at first before slowly settling upon the human carrying her through the storm. She remembered fragments of her escape pod breaking apart inside the atmosphere. She remembered cold. She remembered silence. Now she saw the unfamiliar brown rescue jacket beneath her hands and the steady movements of someone she had been taught her entire life to fear. Every lesson she had learned inside the Vega Empire insisted that humans were reckless, selfish, and dangerous. Yet the stranger carrying her had wrapped her inside his only thermal blanket instead of using it himself. Confusion settled quietly behind her tired eyes. She tried to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped her lips. Jacob heard the sound immediately. "Save your strength," he said gently. "You will need it when we reach shelter." She looked at the frozen landscape passing beneath them. "Why?" she whispered after gathering enough breath. Jacob thought she meant the shelter. "Because it is warm." Her eyes closed briefly before opening once more. "No," she murmured. "Why save me?" Jacob continued walking without changing his pace. "Because you needed someone." The answer arrived so naturally that he never considered saying anything else. To him, there was nothing extraordinary about it. She remained silent for several moments, listening to the steady sound of his footsteps pressing through deep snow. No negotiation, no questions about payment, no demand to know who she was. Only quiet determination moving through the storm. The realization unsettled her more than the freezing wind ever could. Ahead, a jagged ridge of ice forced Jacob to change direction. He climbed carefully across the uneven surface while protecting the woman from sudden movement. His boots slipped once before finding solid ground again. He tightened his grip around the rescue harness and continued forward. The emergency beacon mounted on the roof of the outpost finally pierced the storm as a faint amber light far beyond the drifting snow. Jacob smiled for the first time since leaving shelter. "There it is," he said softly. The woman followed his gaze through half-closed eyes. The tiny point of light looked impossibly distant, yet it remained brighter than anything else surrounding them. She had spent years believing hope came from royal fleets, advanced technology, and powerful bloodlines. Now hope looked like a worn rescue station and an exhausted human who refused to stop walking. Without realizing it, her trembling hand slowly tightened around the shoulder strap of his jacket. Jacob felt the movement and simply kept moving toward the waiting light while the endless storm slowly began to lose its power over both of them. Jacob reached the rescue outpost just as another wave of frozen wind swept across the plain, shaking the reinforced walls hard enough to rattle every loose bolt inside the structure. The amber beacon above the entrance blinked weakly through the storm, its fading light guiding the final steps of a journey that had felt far longer than 5 miles. He pressed his gloved hand against the exterior control panel. The heavy airlock responded with a slow mechanical hiss before opening just wide enough for the bitter wind to rush inside. Warm air spilled outward at the same moment, wrapping around both travelers like an invisible blanket. Jacob crossed the threshold without hesitation. The outer door sealed behind them with a deep metallic sound that instantly silenced the roaring storm. Only the quiet hum of the aging thermal generator remained. He carefully lowered the exhausted woman onto a medical cot positioned beside the heating unit. Frost-covered sections of her damaged survival suit, while tiny crystals of ice clung to strands of her silver hair. Jacob removed his gloves and activated the emergency medical scanner mounted above the bed. Soft blue light moved slowly across her body, measuring temperature, oxygen levels, and suit integrity. The display showed severe exposure to the cold, but no life-threatening internal injuries. Relief quietly settled across his face. He disconnected the cracked power cell from her survival suit and replaced it with one from the station's emergency reserve. A steady green indicator immediately appeared across the monitor. Then he adjusted the room temperature several degrees higher before placing another thermal blanket over her shoulders. Every action came from habit rather than hesitation. The woman slowly opened her eyes as warmth returned to the room. For the first time since the crash, she saw her surroundings clearly. The station looked old, worn, and simple. Steel walls carried years of repair marks. Shelves held carefully organized tools instead of expensive decorations. A kettle rested beside the heater, quietly warming purified water. Nothing inside suggested wealth or prestige. Yet every object had been maintained with care. Jacob poured hot water into 2 insulated cups before mixing a packet of mineral nutrients into one of them. He carried the cup toward her and paused a respectful distance away. "Drink slowly," he said. "It will help your body recover." She accepted the cup carefully, still watching him with uncertain eyes. Her voice remained weak. You trust me enough to remove my power cell. Jacob shrugged gently. It was damaged. You needed a working one. She studied his face, searching for hidden motives that never appeared. You still do not know who I am. He smiled faintly while checking the thermal generator pressure gauge. You are someone who survived a storm. That is enough for today. The answer unsettled her in ways she could not explain. Throughout her life, every introduction inside the Vega Empire had begun with family, rank, duty, or political importance. This human had asked none of those questions. He cared more about her body temperature than her identity. She looked down at the small crystal pendant resting against her suit collar and quietly slipped it beneath the fabric before he could notice its royal design. Jacob remained focused on practical work. He repaired a damaged heating vent, recalibrated the medical scanner, and placed fresh emergency rations beside the bed without expecting conversation. The station filled with peaceful silence broken only by the crackling heater and the distant sound of the storm outside. The woman wrapped both hands around the warm cup and watched the human move through the room with quiet purpose. Every lesson she had ever learned about humans slowly collided with the simple reality standing before her. Beyond the steel walls, the blizzard still ruled the frozen world. Inside the little rescue station, however, the cold had finally begun to lose its grip, and for the first time since her escape pod fell from the sky, she wondered whether the greatest surprise waiting for her had never been surviving the storm, but meeting the stranger who had carried her through it without ever asking for anything in return. Morning arrived without sunlight. Thick clouds still covered the frozen sky, turning the world outside the rescue station into a quiet ocean of white where the horizon no longer existed. The storm had weakened, yet icy wind continued brushing against the steel walls with a steady rhythm that sounded almost peaceful after the violence of the previous night. Inside the station, the generator produced a comforting warmth while soft amber lights reflected across shelves filled with carefully maintained rescue equipment. Jacob finished inspecting the environmental systems before preparing a simple breakfast from emergency supplies. He heated purified water, mixed nutrient grains into a small cooking pot, and divided the meal evenly between two bowls without giving himself a larger portion. When he placed one bowl beside the medical cot, the woman looked at him with quiet surprise. You should eat more, she said softly. You carried both of us through the storm. Jacob smiled while sitting across from her at the small metal table. We both need strength. She lowered her eyes toward the warm meal resting in her hands. No one inside the Vega Empire had ever shared emergency rations equally with someone whose identity remained unknown. Every lesson she remembered from childhood spoke about hierarchy, privilege, and carefully measured obligation. The human sitting opposite her behaved as though none of those rules existed. After several quiet moments, she finally spoke again. My name is Aurelia. Jacob nodded once. Nice to meet you, Aurelia. She waited for another question. None came. He simply continued checking weather reports displayed on the station monitor while eating his breakfast. Curiosity finally overcame her hesitation. You are not going to ask where I came from. Jacob looked toward the frozen landscape outside before answering. If you want to tell me, you will. If you do not, that is your decision. Aurelia studied his expression carefully. She found no suspicion hiding behind his calm voice. No attempt to discover information he could use later. Only quiet respect. She wrapped both hands around the warm bowl, allowing the rising steam to warm her face. Where I come from, she whispered. People believe trust must always be earned. Jacob considered the words for a moment before replying. Maybe, but sometimes kindness has to come first. Otherwise, trust never has the chance to grow. The sentence lingered inside the small station long after he finished speaking. Aurelia looked toward the frost slowly melting from the window, as though searching for an answer beyond the glass. She remembered official lessons describing humans as impulsive and dangerous. Yet nothing inside this quiet shelter matched those stories. The worn rescue station contained no luxury, no impressive technology, and no grand promises. It offered only warmth, honesty, and a stranger willing to help without expecting payment. While Jacob repaired a damaged communications antenna inside the equipment room, Aurelia quietly reached beneath the collar of her survival suit and touched the crystal pendant hidden beneath the fabric. The royal emblem engraved upon its surface represented a truth she had carefully concealed. revealing it would change everything. She was not ready. At least not yet. Across the room, the emergency communications console suddenly produced a sharp electronic tone. Jacob immediately walked toward the receiver. A powerful encrypted transmission fought through the remaining interference before stabilizing across the display. Unknown Vega vessels had entered the region and were broadcasting a continuous search pattern across every emergency frequency. Aurelia heard the familiar sequence of royal identification codes and felt her heartbeat quicken. She recognized the ancient signal instantly. Someone was searching not for an ordinary survivor, but for the one person the Vega Empire believed had disappeared forever. Jacob looked from the monitor toward Aurelia, noticing the sudden change in her expression. He asked only one quiet question. "Do you know who they are?" Aurelia remained silent for several long seconds before slowly lowering her eyes. Outside, the storm had finally begun to fade. Inside the little rescue station, a far greater truth stood waiting just beyond the next conversation. Jacob lowered the volume of the communications receiver until the repeating Vega transmission became a quiet pulse beneath the steady hum of the rescue station. The encoded message continued broadcasting across every emergency frequency, repeating the same request with unwavering precision. Somewhere beyond the thinning storm, an organized search had expanded across the frozen frontier. Aurelia remained seated beside the observation window, her hands wrapped around the empty metal cup that had long since grown cold. The reflection staring back at her from the glass looked less like a survivor and more like someone standing between two different lives. Jacob walked toward the weather console and studied the latest atmospheric report. Wind speeds had fallen enough for aircraft to begin limited operations, but visibility across the ice fields remained unpredictable. He quietly marked several safe landing zones on the station map before glancing toward Aurelia. She had not spoken since the transmission first arrived. He understood silence well enough to know it should never be rushed. Instead of asking more questions, he returned to the maintenance bench and began repairing a damaged emergency locator beacon that had stopped functioning during the storm. The rhythmic sound of metal tools against worn equipment gradually filled the room with quiet familiarity. Aurelia watched him for several minutes before finally breaking the silence. "You truly do not need to know who I am." Jacob continued tightening a connector before answering. "Knowing your name was enough for me." She looked down at the crystal pendant hidden beneath her collar. What if learning the truth brought danger here? Jacob placed the repaired beacon onto the workbench and checked its power indicator. Then we would deal with the danger when it arrived. His answer carried no hesitation. It sounded less like bravery than simple practicality. Aurelia slowly stood and walked toward the observation window overlooking the endless white plain. The storm clouds had begun separating, allowing pale sunlight to spill across frozen ridges that sparkled like fields of crystal. For the first time since waking inside the station, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. "Where I come from," she said quietly. "People rarely help strangers unless they expect something in return." Jacob joined her beside the window, keeping a respectful distance. Frontier rescue work teaches the opposite. If you wait to decide whether someone deserves help, you usually arrive too late. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle inside her. Every lesson from her childhood had been built upon caution, status, and carefully measured trust. Yet the human standing beside her had dismantled years of belief without ever arguing against them. His actions had spoken more clearly than any speech. Suddenly, the communications console produced a different tone. The emergency receiver locked onto a stronger signal. A three-dimensional star map appeared above the projector, displaying dozens of search vessels converging toward their sector. One bright symbol flashed repeatedly at the center of the formation. Aurelia recognized it immediately. It was not merely a military identification. It was the ancient royal beacon activated only when the ruling bloodline faced extinction. Her breathing slowed as the reality finally became impossible to ignore. Jacob noticed the change in her expression and looked toward the projected map. "They are searching very carefully," he observed. Aurelia nodded almost imperceptibly. "They have to." She reached beneath her collar and slowly removed the crystal pendant she had hidden since the crash. As it touched the station lights, intricate silver patterns awakened beneath its surface, filling the room with soft blue radiance. Jacob quietly admired the craftsmanship without recognizing its meaning. Aurelia looked at the glowing emblem resting in her palm before lifting her eyes toward the human who had carried her through the storm without ever asking for her title. After a long silence, she finally spoke with gentle honesty. "There is something I should have told you from the beginning." Outside, the clouds continued opening above the frozen world while the first distant lights of the approaching Vega fleet became visible beyond the horizon, carrying with them a truth that would soon change both of their lives forever. Aurelia held the glowing crystal pendant in her open hand, while soft blue light spread across the rescue station. Delicate patterns rotated inside the ancient crystal, forming symbols that seemed almost alive. Jacob looked at the pendant with quiet curiosity before returning his attention to the communications display. To him, it was a remarkable piece of craftsmanship. Nothing more. Aurelia watched his face carefully, almost expecting recognition that never came. She smiled faintly to herself. Even now, after everything, the human standing beside her still saw a person before he saw status. "This pendant belongs to my family," she said softly. Jacob nodded. "It must be important." She drew a slow breath. "It is." Before she could continue, the communications console emitted another sequence of clear signals. The approaching fleet had entered visual range. Through the observation window, brilliant lights appeared above the frozen horizon like a new constellation descending from the sky. One by one, elegant silver vessels emerged through the thinning clouds, their smooth hulls reflecting pale sunlight across the endless snowfields. They moved with quiet precision, maintaining perfect formation as they approached the rescue station. Jacob stepped closer to the window. "Your people are very organized." Aurelia answered almost absent-mindedly. "They have always been." The lead vessel projected a narrow column of blue light toward the surface before transmitting another encoded message. This time the station's translator successfully decoded part of the broadcast. "Priority Alpha. Locate the lost heir. Confirm survival status immediately." Jacob looked toward Aurelia. The words echoed quietly through the small room. She lowered her eyes, no longer able to avoid the truth. "They are searching for me." Jacob remained silent, giving her time to continue. "My full name is Aurelia Vane." She looked directly at him. "I am the last surviving heir of the Vega Imperial House." The room fell completely still. The heater continued humming quietly while snow drifted past the observation window. Jacob blinked once before looking toward the approaching fleet again. He had expected many possible explanations. Royal heir had never been one of them. Yet his expression changed far less than Aurelia expected. "That explains why they crossed a storm to find you," he said calmly. Aurelia almost laughed through her lingering emotion. "That is all you have to say?" Jacob shrugged gently. "You were still freezing in the snow yesterday." The simple answer dissolved the tension that had filled the room. Aurelia realized he truly meant it. Her title had changed nothing in his eyes because it had never been part of the reason he rescued her. Outside, the lead vessel descended onto the frozen plain several hundred feet from the station. Its landing lights illuminated the ice while graceful ramps extended toward the snow. Figures wearing polished silver armor emerged with disciplined precision. The moment they saw Aurelia standing inside the rescue station, every one of them stopped. The commander slowly removed his helmet. Without speaking, he placed one hand across his chest and lowered himself onto one knee. Every guard beside him immediately followed. Aurelia looked through the window in quiet disbelief. Months of uncertainty ended in a single silent gesture. Jacob watched the scene with respectful distance, finally understanding that the woman he had carried through the storm represented far more than a missing traveler. She represented hope for an entire civilization. The station door chimed softly as the commander requested permission to enter. Jacob stepped toward the control panel, but paused long enough to glance at Aurelia. "Are you ready?" She looked from the kneeling guards outside to the human whose kindness had carried her farther than any royal escort ever could. Then she smiled with calm certainty. "I am now, colon." Jacob pressed the control panel, and the reinforced airlock opened with a slow mechanical sound. Cold air flowed briefly into the station before the inner door sealed once more, leaving only a trace of the fading storm behind. The Vega commander entered first, followed by several royal guardians whose polished silver armor reflected the warm light inside the modest rescue station. The contrast between their ceremonial appearance and the worn steel walls surrounding them could not have been greater. The commander stopped the moment he stood before Aurelia. He lowered himself onto one knee once again, placing a closed fist over his heart. Every guardian repeated the gesture without hesitation. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "the Empire has searched every sector for you. We feared the stars themselves had taken you from us." Aurelia looked at the familiar uniforms before slowly helping the commander rise. "Please stand. We all survived." The commander's eyes briefly shifted toward Jacob. "Our long-range sensors found the remains of your escape capsule. We believed no one could have reached you before the storm." Aurelia turned toward the human standing beside the maintenance console. "Someone did." Every gaze inside the station followed hers. Jacob looked slightly uncomfortable beneath the sudden attention. He simply folded his weathered rescue gloves and placed them on the workbench. The commander approached him with respectful curiosity. "You carried her here?" Jacob nodded once. "She activated an emergency beacon. I answered it." "Did you know who she was?" "No." "Would you have gone if you had known nothing about her?" Jacob smiled faintly. That was already the situation. Silence filled the station once again. The commander had expected courage. He had expected skill. He had not expected such uncomplicated honesty. Aurelia watched the exchange with quiet emotion. Throughout her childhood, she had listened to stories claiming humans always calculated personal gain before offering help. Yet the proof standing only a few feet away had quietly dismantled years of fear without speaking against them even once. One royal advisor entered carrying an elegant crystal case lined with blue light. Inside rested the ceremonial cloak reserved for the Heir of Vega. He carefully presented it before Aurelia. She accepted the garment, but did not immediately place it around her shoulders. Instead, she looked across the small rescue station that had sheltered her through the longest night of her life. The old generator continued humming. The kettle still rested beside the heater. Jacob's repaired tools remained neatly organized on the maintenance bench exactly where he had left them. Every ordinary object reminded her that hope had arrived long before the royal fleet. She carefully folded the ceremonial cloak across one arm before walking toward Jacob. "Before I return with them," she said softly, "there is something every person here should understand." The commander and every guardian turned toward her. Aurelia gently rested one hand over the weathered rescue blanket, still wrapped around her shoulders beneath the royal cloak. "When the Empire had lost me, this human never asked about my title. When the storm hid my name, he never asked what reward waited for saving me. He only carried me because he believed no life should be abandoned." The commander lowered his head respectfully. Several guardians followed. None of them questioned her words. They had all seen the old blanket, the repaired survival suit, and the exhausted rescue station. Those quiet details told a story no official report could ever improve. Jacob looked toward the clearing sky through the observation window. The storm had finally disappeared beyond the distant mountains, leaving fresh sunlight sparkling across the frozen plain. He believed his responsibility had ended the moment Aurelia reached safety. He did not yet realize that the greatest decision of her journey still waited just beyond the rescue station door. The rescue station door opened one final time as sunlight spread across the frozen plains of Vega. The storm that had hidden the world only hours before had vanished beyond the distant mountains, leaving the snow untouched except for a single line of footprints leading from the wilderness to the little steel shelter. Jacob stood quietly beside the entrance, watching technicians prepare Aurelia's transport shuttle. The royal guardians moved with practiced precision, yet their voices remained low, almost reverent, as though they understood that something extraordinary had happened inside the modest building behind them. Aurelia stepped onto the snow wearing the ceremonial cloak of the Vega Imperial House, but she had deliberately left the worn thermal rescue blanket resting over her shoulders beneath it. The simple gray fabric contrasted sharply against the brilliant silver garments of royalty, yet she refused to remove it. One of the royal advisors respectfully approached her. "Your Highness, the official escort is ready." Aurelia nodded but did not move. Instead, she turned toward Jacob. He had already returned to checking the exterior generator, tightening loose connections damaged by the storm. To him, life simply continued. Rescue work rarely paused for ceremony. Aurelia slowly walked across the snow until she stood beside him. Jacob. He looked up and smiled politely. Looks like your people found you. She looked toward the distant fleet before answering. They found me because you refused to stop searching. Jacob brushed fresh snow from his gloves. Anyone would have done the same. The royal commander, standing several yards away, quietly lowered his eyes. Every guardian understood that statement was not true. Thousands of rescue calculations had declared the storm impossible to survive. One human had ignored them all. Aurelia reached into the fold of her ceremonial cloak and removed the glowing crystal pendant that had remained with her since childhood. Instead of placing it around her own neck again, she carefully set it inside Jacob's hand. He immediately tried to return it. This belongs to you. Aurelia gently closed his fingers around the crystal. It always will. But I wanted to remind you that somewhere among the stars, there is an empire that remembers what one human chose to do for a stranger. Jacob looked at the pendant, uncertain what to say. The gift carried enormous meaning, yet she offered it with the same quiet sincerity he had shown when sharing a bowl of warm food in the rescue station. Around them, the royal guardians slowly lowered themselves onto one knee. Not because tradition demanded it, but because gratitude did. Aurelia stepped back and looked across the frozen landscape where the storm had nearly claimed her life. I spent my entire life learning how to lead worlds, she said softly. The first lesson that truly mattered came from a rescue station built from worn steel and quiet kindness. Jacob glanced toward the horizon where sunlight reflected across endless fields of snow. Take care of your people, he replied. They have been waiting for you. Aurelia smiled with calm warmth. And who takes care of you? Jacob looked back toward the little station whose amber beacon still glowed against the brilliant morning sky. There is always another signal. There is always someone waiting. She understood then that his purpose had never depended upon recognition. It existed simply because compassion was the way he chose to live. As the shuttle lifted gently into the clear Vega sky, Aurelia remained by the window until the rescue station became a single point of amber light against the endless white. Long after the fleet disappeared beyond the clouds, Jacob returned to the maintenance bench, repaired one more weather sensor, and placed the crystal pendant beside the communications receiver. Outside, another cold wind crossed the frontier. Inside, the emergency beacon waited quietly for the next call, and somewhere beyond the stars, an entire empire remembered that its future had been carried through a storm on the shoulders of an ordinary human.